So I have 7 o'clock. Vince, are we recording?
Are we?
Yes, we are, sir.
Okay, thank you. I guess we could all rise for the pledge then? I pledge allegiance to
Allegiance
the
to the
flag
flag
of
of the United States
of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Somebody did that.
Thank you. Roll call, please, Ms. Chichuli.
Mrs. Fryrick,
Here.
Mr. Posnell,
Here?
Mr. Robinson,
Here.
Mr. Sanders,
Here.
Mr. Scalette,
Here.
Mrs. Schrader,
She's here.
Mr. Sears,
Here.
Mr. Sullivan,
Here.
Mr. Tillman. Yes, he's here.
I saw
9
it.
members present.
Okay, thank you. Reminder, please mute yourself unless speaking directly. And this is our opportunity for public comment, if you could share.
Have we not seen some of these comments verbatim before? Are we looking at the right poll in terms of the form?
You did see some of these at the last committee meeting. If we have comments between board meetings, we show them at committee meeting and then again at the full board meeting.
Okay, thank you very much.
Are we at the end?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Has everybody had time to complete?
Yes, John, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for your comments. You have a link here for the board minutes of the planning committee meeting of February 8th. If there are no changes, I would offer them approved as submitted. Hearing none, they can be approved. Mr. Sears, the treasurer's report.
Okay, just a little update on interest this year from our funds for January. The interest is just over 29,000. Again, we have a consent agenda. Would any board member like any of the items considered separately, or are there any questions on any of these items? If not, the chair moves approval of the below mentioned items.
You have a second?
Second, Ellen.
Any questions or comments? Then I think this can be a unanimous roll call vote.
This will be considered a unanimous roll call vote unless I hear votes to the contrary. Hearing none, motion passes.
Thank you. And I will cede my time to Dr. Williams tonight since he has a fairly lengthy agenda. So you're up, Dr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Posnow. Tonight we have the annual State of the District report. And just need to bring it up here. Every year around this time, we issue a State of the District report, usually January, February timeframe, based on information we have at that moment about student performance and survey data and things that are going on in the district. The opening screen here is an unusual depiction because of the unusual year. What you see here is a kindergarten top class with parents and students doing some reading. Mrs. Taylor invited them over to Valley View area to do some face-to-face activities in their online course. Those kinds of things happen periodically, and the teachers have been doing yeoman's work trying to adapt to a new paradigm, and this is one example of that. Now, the first section of tonight's report is going to deal with academics. We'll talk a little bit about learning mode, talk a little bit about elementary benchmark data, and we'll talk a little bit about secondary GPA comparisons year to year. First, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the learning modes. Hybrid, we were in hybrid since the beginning of the year, one of a couple districts in the county that did that. And as of March 1st, the elementary students, K-5, will be going back to 4-day in-person learning. And of course, the TOP program runs through that whole time as well. The TOP stands for Trojan Online Pathways. So we'll have students moving in and out those various of those two modes. And in fact, we're going to see that the enrollment in TOP is actually going to go down for the 4th marking period. You can see TOP enrollment hovered anywhere from 20 to 25, 18 to 25%. And you can see the elementary lines there for the 4th marking period are trending downward as more students are coming back to in-person learning. Those numbers haven't been all completely finalized yet, but that's the best numbers we have at the moment. The little image depicted up there above the graph is a kindergarten top student. That's her workspace that she uses every day for her schooling. Now, Acadience benchmark data. We use Acadience to see how students are doing as compared to how they should be doing. So one very important aspect to keep in mind here is that this test measures where a student should be at that moment in time. So it's at the beginning of the year and mid-year is typically when this is done. Now on this chart here, this is English language arts. The black bar is October of 2019. Now that's kind of significant to keep in mind because it's October of 2019. At that last year, the testing folks recommended we do that in October as opposed to September. This year we're back on September because we needed to know where the kids were at that moment in time when they walk in our doors at the beginning of the year. So what you're seeing here is 2019 October compared to 2020 September. So we do expect a gap because there's a month, the black bars represent a month of schooling, where the orange bars represent no schooling at the beginning of the year. So you can see that 87% of kindergartners, for example, last year in October were proficient as compared to the standards for that grade. This year, 57% of them were in September proficient on the standards for that grade at that moment in time. And you can see the progression for kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth, and fifth grade. Now, mid-year for English language arts. Now remember, this is not compared to what they knew in the beginning of the year to what they knew mid-year. This is mid-year based on what they should, where they should be mid-year in the school year. You can see that in kindergarten, we have a bit of a gap there, but as you move up through the grade levels, the gap diminishes. So the kindergartners and first graders, we have some work to do there, and in second grade as well. You can see things starting to level out in third, fourth, and fifth grade. So not only did they close the gap more, but they did it from a deficit. So over the time of the year, the first half of the year, teachers brought kids more quickly up to where they needed to be, closing the gap, but not quite getting all the way. Now for math, comparing October of 2019 to September of 2020, same kind of paradigm for the ELA. The black bar is October of 2019 and the orange bar is September of 2020. This is for math, and this is compared to where the student should be at this point in time, at the beginning of the school year. Keep in mind that the black bar represents a month into school, and the orange bar represents the beginning of this current school year. And you can see there are some gaps. So that's the beginning of the year. The next slide is going to be the middle of the year. You can see in third grade mid-year, the gap is negligible. Other years still have a gap. Some bigger, some smaller. But from the deficit they came from to where they are now mid-year, a significant improvement. And going back 4-day in-person instruction, we believe that those gaps can be closed even more from the prior year. So that's the elementary data. So we don't have Acadience for secondary. So what we have to, the data we do have is marking period averages from year to year. So on this chart, you can see that if you think of the two gray bars as being related and the two orange bars as being related, you can see that the dark gray is 1920 marking period 1. The lighter gray is 2021 marking period 1. So that's marking period 1 to marking period 1 for the gray bars. The darker orange is last year marking period 2, and the lighter orange is this year marking period 2. So you can pretty easily see the comparisons between marking periods. It's important to keep in mind, though, also, and same is true of the Acadience data for elementary. We're comparing cohort to, in this case, cohort to a different cohort. So this is comparing this year's 6th graders to last year's 6th graders, for example. This year's 7th graders to last year's 7th graders. This year's 8th graders to last year's 8th graders, and so on and so forth. So you can see where we are for marking periods 1 and marking periods 2 in grade 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. You can see, for example, in grade 7, there's not a lot of differences there, but in some other grades there are greater differences. Another thing to keep in mind is that the standard deviation for grades 9 and 10 is double and sometimes triple what the standard deviations are for the other years, which implies that there's a greater number of outliers away from the mean in those averages, which can skew the results a little bit. You want a lower standard deviation, and some of them have very high standard deviations. So that would imply that there are some outliers in the data. So that's English language arts. We have them for the 4 main disciplines. For math, you can see the comparisons there. Remember, the gray is marking period 1 and the orange is marking period 2 from year to year. Same for science. Remember, the gray is marking period 1, the orange is marking period 2. Social studies. So any questions about that data before we move on to the parent survey results?
Tim, this is Joel.
Yeah.
Yeah, the question I ask, I guess, is at a high level. You know, you can take a look at the numbers as granularly as you like, but if you pull back a little bit, what's the takeaway? What are the strategic and even the tactical implications of this data moving into the next marking period?
Well, at the elementary level, we're excited about the possibility of having more face time with our elementary students. We believe we can close those benchmark gaps fairly well, especially in grades 3, 4, and 5. Where we really need to pay the attention is kindergarten and 1st and 2nd, where the gaps are larger. Grades 3, 4, and 5, the gaps are almost closed and should have no trouble closing them in the 4th marking period. We believe that at kindergarten through 2nd grade, we can close them fairly well too. The secondary level, we have students who are struggling. As you can tell from the standard deviation being so far down, we've got a lot of students doing fairly well. We also have a lot of students that are, not a lot of students, we have a handful of students that are really not being very successful at the moment. And we're working with them and trying to get them headed in the right direction. So the strategic takeaways are changing learning mode in the elementary level and focusing on students who need a little bit of help at the secondary level.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tim, what do you describe as extra help for the ones that are struggling? Is that focus time on Wednesdays or?
Well, we do have students in the building on Wednesdays, as a matter of fact, to try to help with some of this, making up work or working with tutors and those kinds of things at the secondary level. The TIP program is helpful too, and making better use of that, and just more frequent contact with students and parents when they're not face to face.
All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Tim, with
Dr.
the
Williams,
9th and 10th grade classes, which seem to have the greatest amount of outliers, what's the attendance rates like in those 2 grade levels?
You know, I don't have the answer for that, but I'll try to find that out. And we'll see how
Or
that.
even across the board, you know, I just has that been looked at in terms of check-ins on virtual days, attendance in class, quarantining?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that is monitored by the building principals. And that would have been a good bit of data to throw into this report. It didn't cross my mind to throw it in there.
Yeah, no problem. I just thinking out loud.
Yeah, no, it's a good thought.
Dr. Williams, I go back to where you say that some of the children in school aren't actually in person in school. Do you know how many students that involves on Wednesdays? I mean,
oh, no,
yeah.
I don't have a number for you, how many students that involves. For some students, transportation would be an issue, of course, because we're not running buses on those days, obviously. But I'm not going to venture a number because it varies so greatly. When I walk in the building, some Wednesdays it's not very, it's more of a ghost town. Other Wednesdays there's a fair number of students milling about. So it varies. It varies greatly.
Okay, so there are a lot of factors as to whether this child gets the help or can get to the help on an in-person level versus having some, just
Right.
direct time, Zoom time with their teacher.
Right. Yeah, the electronic means are always available, of course. But the FaceTime, the face-to-face stuff is also available, but not as plentiful, obviously, as the electronic.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question. I know how difficult it can be to interpret data like this. Do I understand correctly that ultimately the reason you care about presenting this data about grades is that they're proxies for levels of learning? Is that ultimately the why we should care about these grade comparisons? Is it gives us some handle on how students learning is happening over time in relationship to a year?
Yes, and that's a good point. Because there's some conventional wisdom out there that kids aren't learning anything this year because of COVID. Well, that's not true. And we haven't changed our standards and expectations. We're still holding to those same standards and expectations. And so we felt it was important to look at the data, how they're doing this year as compared to the prior cohort, marking period 1 to marking period 2, to get a sense of how well students are doing in general. We don't have student achievement data to go on, so we have to use this data. So the theory being that if they're doing well in school here, which is usually the case, if they're doing well in school, they're going to do well in standardized tests. So the GPA data is going to help us determine how well students are doing from year to year.
So thanks. Yeah. So I just want to see if you can speak to any more of those nuances, looking at this in terms of how the district assesses the amount of learning. So for example, is this data taking as a premise that the grading standards have not changed because
Correct.
of the pandemic? So that's the underlying premise.
Right.
Now there is, however, some change in how assessments are made, even if the standards haven't changed. So for example, if I take an exam in class closed book, it's a different scenario than if I take an exam online open book. So you might use the same grading standards, but there might be a different mode of assessment that would then make it maybe a little muddier or unclear the amount of learning that's going on.
Well, they obviously can't use all of the assessments the same way they did in the past, but they're still assessing the same knowledge, the same content. They may have to do it in a slightly different way, but it's still the same learning that they're assessing, because it's the same learning that they taught. They probably had to teach it differently because of the environment, and they probably can't issue the same exact instrument that they use to assess that learning. They might have to use a different instrument in this environment.
Thank you. I don't have a view to express on this other than to bring out some of the nuance and how we understand the meaning of this data.
Dr. Williams, as long as we were talking about testing, big question. Are we doing Keystones and PSSAs this year? What's the final decision? Which is, that's the big kahuna when it comes to testing.
Yeah, sure it is. And we're going to do what we're told to do.
Yeah.
Frankly, and this is not a popular sentiment, but frankly, I actually hope we're going to be issuing PSSAs and Keystones, because I believe that the results are going to surprise people. But we have no final word from PDE as to when or if standardized testing will happen. We believe it will, because it's controlled by the federal government to some degree, but to a large degree, and they've not made any concessions at this point in time. The feds have not.
Concessions meaning not doing it as opposed to doing it.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I guess you can move on.
All right. Now, we issued back in January a parent survey and asked parents a whole lot of questions. And the same questions we asked the prior year. So now we have data we can compare year to year. And we'll share those results of those questions with you now. The particulars of the survey, this year we had over 1,000 responses. Last year we had less than half that. So the response was really great this year. The four choices they could make for each question were strongly disagree, disagree, agree, or strongly agree. So we could use a Likert scale. 1 point for strongly disagree and 4 points for strongly agree. And the 2 and 3 for the 2 in the middle. There was a fairly even distribution among the grades. The lowest response rate was from grade 8, 9.37% of the responses were from parents of grade 8 students. The highest was grades 3 and 9 with 13.27%, and the rest were spread out between those two percentages. As far as reported ethnicity, those are the numbers there for the number of respondents. You'll notice that there were 71 people who declined to choose one of those, and that's fine. We felt it was important to give people that option. And if you look at the respondents by ethnicity and compare it to our actual demographic, you can see the white Caucasian group had a higher response rate than their actual demographic, and the other had lower than their actual demographic. No commentary on that, that's just the facts. First question, York Suburban School District is a supportive and inviting place for students. When you compare year to year, let me turn the pointer on. So here's, this column here is 2021, and then the strongly agree, disagree, agree, strongly agree, and then a weighted average. I'll talk about that in a minute. In this row here, you can see the percentages that have responded to those categories, to those markers. And then you can see the 11.34% is the total of disagree and strongly disagree. And then the 88.6 is the total of agree and strongly agree. So it gives you several different ways to look at the data. And you have in the gray box 2020 and the same construct for this. Now the weighted average, for example, for 2021, you know, those who, every response for strongly disagree was 1 point, every response for disagree was 2 points, every response for agree was 3 points, and every response for strongly agree was 4 points. So from year to year, you can see that we have pretty similar weighted average, pretty similar agree or strongly agree percentage. Although you can see in here that last year we had a higher number, higher percentage, I should say, of responses in the strongly agree category than we did this year. But we can see we have a stronger agree percentage this year as opposed to last year, and so on and so on. So that's how all these questions are going to be structured. So we'll page through them one at a time. There's 11 of them. And the nice thing about the way we have this survey structured is that we can compare from year to year and see if we're improving or declining. York Suburban School District is safe. This marks the biggest increase of any response that we've had. I'm guessing the pandemic has a lot to do with it. You can see that 35% of our respondents strongly agree that the district was safe this year. And I'm sure that when they responded to this, they were thinking in terms of COVID as opposed to any other kinds of safety notions. But this is the responses for safety. This one is about communication from the district. You can see that there's an uptick in this year's data compared to last year's. This is about an academically rigorous program. Response rate, the response has declined here a little bit. I'm assuming largely due to learning mode. And you can see the numbers there. Our agree percentage is higher, but our strongly agree percentage is lower by a fair amount. And our disagree percentage is higher than it was last year. Same with strongly disagree.
Tim, do you think you could do correlations between this perception and what we saw in here last year to this year? Results, from grading. If I look at this and I see that the perception is that things aren't as strong. If you go back and you look at the grades from earlier on, things aren't as strong, but I wonder what how different they are, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Perception versus reality,
Yeah, we had some conversation about that internally because we're holding students to the same standards. They're not quite as successful this year as they were last year, largely due to the learning mode, I presume. So, the perception is that we're not as rigorous, but we're holding them to the same standards.
Okay, yeah.
So, there could be a misalignment there. I don't know, but this is, this obviously is all perception data. So.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're trying to get at here. I don't have a good answer for you.
Yeah.
And board members, if you have a question somewhere along any of these, just please chime in.
Is it a fair assumption, Doctor, or shouldn't make an assumption, observation that the pandemic was the overriding arching, what they considered? I mean, they said that there's more communication. Yeah, there's been a lot more communication. Yeah. Daily letters. I mean, that kind of a thing. I just.
Yeah, the pandemic colors all of this. And frankly, in some cases, I'm surprised that some of the responses were as positive as they were in light of the pandemic.
Right.
It's just a crazy year. But I think it's because the positive responses are because parents see how hard teachers are working and appreciate that, even though it's not their ideal view of how education should be delivered. It's not our ideal of how education should be delivered either, but it's the circumstances we found ourselves in. I'm trying to make the best of that situation. So yes, to answer your question, I think the pandemic has colored all of this.
Thank you.
You're welcome. This is a question about college and career pathways. You can see we've got, here's one of these strange things that you can look at the data a bunch of different ways. You can see the weighted average is pretty similar from one year to the next. But you also see there's a pretty large increase in the percentage of strongly agree at 85% as compared to 82.9. Now, What accounts for that difference, though, in the weighted average is that we had strongly agree number percentage a little bit lower this year than last year, even though the agree is higher this year as opposed to last year. So there's a couple different ways to look at all of this data. That's just one of them. The York Suburban School District treats families fairly. We see a little bit of an uptick here. We thought about not putting this question in this year because of the pandemic, because we're basically telling people not to come in the building. And events are for a while there couldn't be attended at all. But we left it in for the sake of year-to-year comparison. And those are the results this year. We fully expected this to decline, and it certainly has.
Did item response go down in 2021? Did you have people trying to skip the question in 2021 that you didn't in?
We didn't see an item response decline, but I'll double check that. I don't remember seeing one. That's number 7. Okay. York Suburban School District respects cultural diversity. We're seeing a little bit of an uptick here, which is welcome news. I have some additional data to add to this slide. So our overall percentage of agree or strongly agree has increased to 92.96%, which is a significant difference over the prior year. So let's take a little bit deeper dive into that. So for 2021, the respondents, we were able to parse it out based on ethnicity, and we removed the 71 people who declined to list their ethnicity. And you can see that the weighted average for white respondents was 3.21. The weighted average for non-white respondents was 3.08, which to me says something. It says that, people from the non-white category don't believe as strongly as the people from the white category. So I think it's something we need to be aware of and need to figure out a way to address. York Suburban School District is interested in what I have to say. I think if we did this poll today, I'm not sure we get the same responses, and understandably so. But we did have an uptick here. Remember, this was done in January. I'd recommend York Suburban. We have a decline here, a slight decline. And the last one, same as we had last year, was the last question. Satisfaction with York Suburban School District is better than it was a year ago, and we have a decline here as well. In the weighted average, we have an increase in the agree, strongly agree, but still the weighted average is down a little bit.
Tim, I must say, this is one of the last question is the one that really is very difficult for me to interpret. Being a literalist, I could say I'm 100% in favor of the school district. It does the absolute best in every area And it's been that way for years. So therefore, I strongly disagree that I feel that you're doing better.
Right.
I just think it's a poorly worded question.
Yeah, it's the question we have, and that we wanted to stick with it because it gives us year-to-year comparison. So, maybe we need to figure out, maybe we need to ask this question in a different way. We just haven't figured out what that better way would be, because I completely understand what you're saying. They could be satisfied, but feel it's not as good as it was the prior year. And if you look at this, the question number 10, that would, if you're looking at that, it would imply that this number should be better, but it's not. So
you've spent a year stuck inside with COVID. How can you be as happy as you were last year?
Well, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who would have preferred that we were back to school 4 or 5 days a week all year long, and would view this as a way to say, well, no, okay, you guys are doing all right, but I'm really not happy with the way it is right now. There could be some of that. And there could be some people who say we shouldn't be back at all, and that's why you're not doing as well as you did a year ago. So there are a whole bunch of different ways to look at this question.
Well, and that sort of speaks to my question. What is the goal when we send these questions out, and see that 13% of our stakeholders who responded are not satisfied with the communication? Do we take this I'm just pulling that one out. But do we take the results of these and apply them to what we do? I mean, what do we gain by finding out this information if we don't do that?
Yeah, well, we can use the communication one as an example.
Yeah.
If we had, what we're seeing here is that the communication that we have done, at least up until January, was well received as compared to the prior year. So we're looking for improvement. We're looking to see where we're improving and maybe where we're not. So we have fewer people unhappy with the communication in 2021 than we did in 2020. So that's a positive, so that we look back on the things that we did differently and think, okay, well, those were things that we should continue to do because they've helped change that perception a little bit. So we use this information to try to figure out if and how we can do something differently, or to validate or eliminate some of the things that we are doing.
Then that leads to the question, Tim, of when you unpack the data, can you make the correlation? Let's use communication as an example. Can you point to concrete actions that were taken that would have, should have, and did improve the perception about communication in the district?
We can only make some educated guesses as to that, because we didn't ask them, what kinds of communication they prefer to receive, and that kind of a thing.
But you know what we've done in the year between these two surveys.
Yeah, we've issued much more email than we have in the past, mostly because of the circumstances. I don't know that we would have issued so much email to parents this school year if it had not been for COVID, and informing them of what's going on in the cases and whatnot. We've even gotten to the point where when we have no cases for COVID, we let them know that too, so that they know that, they didn't miss some communication about the COVID cases on that particular day. So we're pretty much communicating every day on that issue. Now, outside of COVID, I don't know that parents would want that volume of email coming to them. I'm looking forward to finding out when we get back to some semblance of normalcy.
Well, and on the flip side of that, they could in fact be annoyed that they get so much and are therefore not satisfied.
They could.
I mean, we don't know given the question. And I just think COVID clouds things up so that it's really difficult to know what the data are telling us.
Yeah, because this is just a perception survey and just to get some high level view of how people feel about the 11 things we asked them about.
Just to interject, I think bringing up the communication one is actually a really good point because, you know, last year we looked at that, we saw people were not as happy with the communication. So we went out, we asked people, how would they like to receive messages from us? These are the different ways we communicate. Some of the things that we saw was that people really wanted to receive text messages much more. So then we made a concerted effort to make sure that we collected that information and we started text messaging parents much, much more. We expanded and, you know, our social media presence because people use those. So I think we're seeing exactly what you're saying. We're taking this data, we're using this as a baseline to ask more questions, solicit more specific feedback, develop an implementation plan to address that so that we can improve upon, you know, meeting the needs of the community. So I think pulling the communication one just off the top of my head, I recall all those things, you know, that we did to address that.
That's exactly right. Thank you, Vince. Okay. And ready to move on to the final section? Post-pandemic. We're looking forward to post-pandemic. And this last section will get at the heart of some of the things that have been discussed in the public comment section. What schools, the General Assembly in Pennsylvania is tasked through the PA School Code to provide a thorough and efficient educational program to students of the Commonwealth, and therefore that responsibility passes down to school boards. So we have some growing pressures that we're trying to deal with. The academic area, of course, benchmarks, which we addressed earlier, class sizes, which is something that is often mentioned in the commentary from parents in the public comment section tonight, and the idea of equity among students across the district. So those are some challenges that pressures we're facing moving forward. And we'll outline some of that stuff on the 8th. It's particularly class sizes, because there's a perception that class sizes will increase with the realignment of buildings. And if we do not realign buildings, we'll show numbers that we'll use actual numbers and show how not realigning will actually put pressure on class sizes to go up with the financial constraints that we're under. So we'll outline that all next week or next time. We also need to address social emotional learning, the Continue with Trauma-Informed initiative that started last year, famously on Friday the 13th last year when the pandemic cooled down. Rather bizarre coincidence, but nonetheless, that was the case. So we will continue with that. We have some fiscal situations we have to deal with. We've got a structural deficit that it's structural, so it's there. It's not going to go away on its own, and we're going to have to compensate for that somehow. And we're also facing some physical plan issues. All buildings are in some level of need of repair for the infrastructure. Some buildings less than others, some buildings more than others. For example, at the high school, we have a steam generated power plant that is literally 50 years old, 60 years old, something like that. And parts are hard to come by, and knowledge to repair that thing is hard to come by anymore. Because most of the people who worked in that field when that was new have long since retired. So we face many challenges like that. So last year during the State of the District report, I did display this graphic. The graphic, I use it this way because you could see a crack in the finance leg, a crack in the facilities leg. And the thing that can hold all of this together to promote student success is grade level realignment. So this was a concept that was laid out last year at this time, and prior to that as well. Now, how are we going to address these things and become more thorough and efficient? Well, to be thorough, we have to have equitable and appropriate access to resources. The way we're structured now does not provide a lot of easy access for students who need resources, particularly in the areas of special education, English language learning, and reading, math support, those kinds of things. We also need to be efficient. We need to maximize our resources in a cost-effective way. And I want to point out here that the conceptual framework that was released in 2019, May of 2019, while that's not what's currently on the table, gives you an idea of the kinds of things that we would need to do for long-term to be financially stable so we can continue to offer the education that students and parents have come to be accustomed to. So as far as the grade level realignment proposal, we're looking at March 8th for presentation. On March 22nd, the board would then vote on an intent to modify the grade levels. That's not a final decision on March 22nd. At the end of March, we would have a public hearing on the topic where we would receive feedback from public. And then end of June would be a final board vote on that issue if the board decided to go down that path. And it has to happen by the end of June because PDE will only entertain school realignments and closures between July 14th and July 31 for the following year. So this would all have to be done in that timeline by the end of June so that we can notify PDE in July. A lot of parents already know this URL because it was in both the letters that we sent out recently, but it contains a lot of the information that's been before the board and the committees since about 2 years ago. And so for long-term sustainability for 2021, 22 and beyond, we need to look for ways to become more thorough and efficient. Because as we will see in the upcoming budget presentation, we have some real challenges fiscally, and we're looking for ways to improve the educational program and become more efficient at the same time. So that's at the heart of the realignment proposal, which we'll lay out in more detail on the 8th. And that concludes the State of the District report. Do board members have any questions?
Dr. Williams, this might have been more appropriate for the initial section on assessments, but I wanted to make sure that you got all the way through your presentation. Is it too soon to be talking about the administration's intent for programming any funds that might be coming for addressing learning loss? Do you have a sense in talking with our building leadership and individual educators how they intend to help address some of those apparent deficits that we saw in the first section of your presentation?
Yeah, it is a little early to come to any conclusions about how something like that would be delivered, especially since I want to see what Acadience data looks like in the coming months. I have a lot of confidence that the teachers will be able to close that gap even more. And we're seeing that already between beginning a year and mid-year. And we'll probably see that gap continue to close. So there will be federal funds available for that could be devoted to learning loss. And we can use those funds for that if it's necessary.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other
Nothing else?
questions? Okay,
I think you're done.
that concludes my report.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Chuli.
Good evening. Under the business office report, we have 2 items for board consideration and vote. The first item is the approval of 2 bus van drivers for Reliance Transportation. The first is Pamela Duncan and the second is Ariel Kepler.
So moved.
Second, Ellen.
Questions or comments? This can be a unanimous roll call vote.
This will be considered a unanimous vote call vote unless I hear votes to the contrary. Hearing none, motion passes. Second item is the consent agenda. You have before you the business office report, which includes items 1 through 11. Would any board member like any of these items considered separately, or are there any questions on any of these items? If not, I would ask that a motion be made to approve the below mentioned items.
This is Steve Sullivan. Just asking quickly, is there any possibility for any of the building specific items 8 through 11 to be mooted by any discussions to come having to do with realignments? And do we need to talk about the timing of any of these decisions?
Are you looking to table them? Are you looking to separate them?
Well,
Let's do that first. Can we do 1 through 7 and then separate 8 through 11 out and have a discussion about it?
Yes.
So we need a motion to approve items 1 through 7.
So moved.
Second, Sears.
Are there questions, comments, or discussions about items 1 through 7? Then that can be a unanimous roll call vote.
Okay. This will be considered a unanimous vote call vote unless I hear votes to the contrary. Hearing none, motion passes.
Now, can we have a motion to approve items 8 through 11?
So moved.
Second, Ellen.
Now, Stephen.
Yeah, I appreciate the everyone's accommodation of the question, and which I'm not entirely certain is even in order, but I didn't want to fly past the question of hundreds of thousands of dollars in building specific investments when there's a probability bounded away from zero that the building in question might be one of the ones that the district chooses away from in the realignment plan. So I didn't want to not have discussed it as we move forward.
Okay.
I'm kind of with you there, Steve. And I guess in my mind, the question is, are the doors in such terrible shape that they need to be done in any case? I don't know if anybody can answer that specifically for me. But that might be nice.
I can try to give you a little more information, and I certainly understand the board's concern, not knowing, what building might be affected by whatever decisions are made. Part of this door replacement project also involves obviously 1 door at Indian Rock and I believe 10 exterior doors at the middle school. Those are definitely doors that need to be replaced. There are security issues there. There are exterior doors too. At East York, the majority, I believe we have 80 some doors. The majority of those are interior doors. Some of those doors, not all of them, but some of those doors are in such poor condition that they actually will not close and lock if that would be necessary to do. A good bit of the hardware that is on those doors is the original hardware. So some of that hardware is all but 50 years old. So that's starting to fail as well. Certainly we can replace that hardware as needed, and we do that now, although it's becoming extremely difficult to get without doing some major other renovations or retrofits to the existing doors. But there are a number of existing doors, interior doors, I'm sorry, at East York that are in very, very poor condition. They're basically held together with masking tape, but not to say that we cannot maintain them until, you know, a decision is made. But I think we're going to be faced with a lot of these decisions over the next couple of months until we make decisions on what we're going to do with the buildings. They're going to be tough to put off. So anyhow, I don't know if that helps you or not.
And if we delayed an actual vote a month, what kind of shape would, or 2 months, what kind of shape would that put you in, Barry, in order to get the work done?
Sure. And I think the answer there is one of the reasons that we put this project out for bid as early as we did was to ensure, obviously doors have a very long lead time in from the time that they're manufactured to the time they're actually delivered to the job site. So there'd be a very good possibility that we would not have the doors installed for the opening of school, that we wouldn't receive them in time. And that was one of the challenges that we were faced with the high school when we replaced doors at the high school. A large number of them didn't come in till the very last minute, so we really had to scurry, and some of those doors weren't even installed for the opening of school too. We had to extend that a little bit beyond September. So it's really the delivery time there. Now, my view is, I mean, and I absolutely respect the decisions the board's going to have to make on what we're going to be doing with the buildings, but I would assume that even the least at East York, no matter what we do with that building, those doors, if we replace them, would not be good money spent to bad. You know, I think that I think it'd be a wise investment to do it now.
An option that the board does have is to approve the bids and de-scope the project. And de-scoping the project would just address the doors that would need to be done immediately. So for instance, if the board just wanted to do East York Elementary, then we could de-scope the project to just do East York. That is also an option.
One assumes that with the approval of these bids, the contractors would want to put orders in immediately, and that there might be some, I imagine there's not something equivalent to a restocking fee, if not a complete financial penalty, if an order is canceled or de-scoped after.
We would de-scope the project first and then issue a letter of a notice of intent so that they can start. But the de-scoping would come first.
I will certainly defer to Mr. Gerling's view that the buildings might not be suitable for purpose, no matter what their purpose, if particularly the exterior doors aren't addressed. And I appreciate the forbearance of my colleagues in following me down this rabbit hole, but I wanted to make sure that we had a conversation about it.
Well, if I could ask one more question of clarification from what you said, Kathy. If we approve this and then there was a de-scoping, would it then come back to the board for another vote on the de-scoping?
It absolutely will.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Can we do a roll call vote on this?
Yes, sir.
What are we voting on? Refresh my memory.
On the approval of items 8 through 11.
And how does that fit in the de-scoping conversation?
Yeah.
We can have a separate motion to authorize the business office to work with Crabtree to bring back a de-scope scenario.
But this could hold up the whole process of ordering doors. Is that correct, Kathy?
I think it would, I think if we bring back a D-scope for the first board meeting in March, I don't think that we will have a tremendous delay.
Mr. Gerling, what's the lead time on these doors usually, given your past experience with this? I'm just curious.
Well, I believe from the time that the orders are placed from the contractor, and there has to be a lot of things that happened prior to that, but you're probably looking 8 to 10 weeks for delivery of the door. But again, there's approval processes, submittals and so forth that have to take place with that. But descoping is definitely an option. We'd have to sit down and figure out, as again, I think my highest priority would be the exterior doors at the middle school and one exterior door at Indian Rock, because those are really exterior security concerns that we have. Those doors are in very poor condition. The hardware is, well, they pose a security risk more so than the interior doors at East York.
I just want to make sure what we're voting on. We're voting on to not approve these, and then we have to make another motion to de-scope. Is that, am I correct there? We'll need a second motion.
We're voting to approve.
Okay, but if they, let me reverse it. If we're not approving them, then we want to vote. No, I just want to make sure how I want to vote here. I'm not following the conversation then.
If we
There's a
vote
motion to
no-
approve.
If we vote no, then these items are stricken. It does not pass.
If we vote,
yes, then we're also saying that we could de-scope.
Okay, all right, okay, thank you. Just want to be sure what I'm voting for.
so I guess you can proceed with a roll call vote.
Okay. Mr. Robinson,
Yes.
Mr. Sanders,
Yes.
Mrs. Schrader,
Yes.
Mr. Tillman, I'm sorry, Mr. Tillman, I can't hear you. No, okay. Mr. Scalette,
Yes.
Mr. Sears,
Yes.
Mr. Sullivan,
Yes.
Mrs. Fryrick,
Yes,
Mr. Posnell.
Yes.
Okay.
So now will the administration come back to us at the next board meeting to recommend steps if we want to de-scope, or do we put a motion out right now?
You can put a motion out authorizing the business office to work with Crabtree to provide the board with a de-scope of the project.
I move we ask the business office to work with Crabtree to de-scope this project.
Second.
Thank you. Questions or comments?
You need to seek some public comment. Just give it a few minutes to see if anything comes in.
Okay.
I'm gonna look. So far, I have no additional public comment.
Should be good to go then.
Then I think this can be a unanimous roll call vote.
This will be considered a unanimous vote call vote unless I hear votes to the contrary. Hearing none, motion passes. Okay. Moving on to items C under informational report. You have the food service department report. I won't go into those, but you have those there for your review. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll be happy to answer them for you. The second item, Wendy, if you just could click on the year-to-date budget report. So the year-to-date budget report is before you, and as you can see, our revenues are in line, I would say in line with this time last year. We have received 82.38% of our total budgeted revenues, whereas last year we were at 82.78%. So not much change there, which is great. I would like to highlight several areas in the revenue section. For real estate, we've collected 101% of our total budgeted revenues that we have. So we budgeted for $40.7 million in real estate taxes. We came in at $590,000 more than what we projected. And if you recall, we had budgeted tax collections at 96%. And so what this tells me is that our revenues came in at 97%, and therefore we did not see an impact due to COVID in relations to our real estate taxes.
Right.
In the earned income tax area, while we have good months and bad months, we are still up $42,000 from this time last year, which is a plus. Another area where we are performing well is in the real estate tax transfer taxes. We budgeted $625,000, anticipating that we would see some decline in activity due to COVID. However, because of the market and the interest rates, we've actually seen an increase in home sales. And so that has benefited us quite significantly. We are currently over our budgeted amount by $90,000. In delinquent real estate taxes, we're down slightly. We've only collected 47% of our total budgeted revenues at $600,000. For interest earnings, Mr. Sears went over that before you at the Treasurer's report, and we're at 91% of our total budgeted. So we've received $154,000. We budgeted $169,000 in anticipation that we would see lower interest rates because of COVID. On the expenditure side, you'll see that we're slightly higher than where we were last year at 49.64%. But again, there's several changes in this area. We have a higher PSERS rate, we have higher healthcare insurance premiums rate, and then we also do have expenditures due to COVID. But overall, I think as far as our budget year to date, there are no concerns, no red flags, and we're performing as expected. Are there any questions on the year to date budget? Okay, we can move on to the COVID impact. And Wendy, thank you so much. This is a slightly different way of looking at it, different from what I've shown in the past. And it's because there's so much activity going on that I wanted to make sure that I split out 1920 versus 2021. And as we get more grants, this will extend to 21-22 and possibly 22-23. And so you'll see on the top, it says revenues, and these are the revenues that we've received to date. And on the notes side, you'll see some comments that we've made. For instance, on COVID-19 PCCD1, that was our first school and safety grant that we received for COVID relief. We've expended all of that money, and the grant was extended until September 30th of 2021. However, we did expend it. COVID-19 PCCD number 2 was additional monies that we received. We received $98,345. And we used that money to offset some of those custodial costs that we had incurred that were above all the other grants that we had received. Another mention that I wanted to make on the revenue side is the York County grant. You were notified that we applied and received the $50,000 for York County. That money was used to offset some of the costs for top students, particularly for BYU courses. On the expenditure side, you'll see the expenses both for 1920 and 2021 and how they're broken down. And you'll see when we compare revenues to expenditures that currently we're just down 155,000. And I apologize, I said just down, but for me, I think that that's a positive that we've been able to, one, control costs, and try to figure things out as we're going. And that really is kudos to the administration, both in central office and at the buildings, for making sure that we continue to be mindful of the budget, but at the same time ensure that we're providing safety in our buildings. But that is the current impact to the budget and our expenses to date. Are there any questions on COVID impacts?
Kathy, it's Joel. The question is the alignment, I guess, of the revenue and the expenses. Just a clarification. In the revenue area, you've got the COVID-19 PCCD number 2 at 98,345.
Yes.
And expenditures, it shows up as a GEER expense.
Yes, I put that in the wrong line item. Thank you for picking that up. I did pick that up before we went live on today, and so I will make that change. It just needs to go up 2 more spaces. And I'll make that correction and post it on the agenda.
What would that leave in the gear line?
We have not expended that money.
So that means
money is
total
being
expenditures
reserved.
are correct?
All the expenditures are correct. We are reserving that gear money for compensatory ed during the summer.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Kathy, the York County grant, the $50,000, is that actually money from the county, or is that federal money that was filtered through the county?
I believe it was federal money filtered through the county. They received COVID relief money, and they just dispersed money to the districts.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay. Moving on to the 21-22 budget, and actually, Wendy, I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. Thank you. Okay. So tonight's update is really to focus on 2 things. One, the governor's proposal, and some updates that we have done to the 21-22 budget. And so we'll, as always, review the Act 1 timeline, go over the governor's proposal, and discuss the updates to the budget, and then walk through some considerations. So as we stand now, we are at the end of February, and this is the second budget presentation. We have heard the governor's report upcoming in March. We'll continue to provide the board with budget updates, perhaps have a proposed final presentation with a proposed final adoption in April, and then a final budget adoption in May. These are PDE deadlines. I'll just mention 2, as I always have. The two absolute deadlines are May 31st is the deadline for school districts to adopt a proposed final, and June 30th is the deadline for school districts to adopt a final budget. Regardless of whether or not the state has a budget in place, we're obligated to meet those deadlines. So as I've discussed in previous presentations, our budget goals are listed, and these are the items that we follow. These are the goals that we follow as we're looking at the budget and making decisions and making recommendations to the board. So moving on to the governor's budget. On Wednesday, February 3rd, the governor delivered his budget address, and I'm sure many of you have heard the details and responses to the budget. Many have described the governor's budget as being very bold, which I think I tend to agree with. And so tonight we'll unpack some of those details, not all of them, and discuss how they impact York Suburban. And so some of the details on the governor's budget. He proposed a $1.3 billion increase to basic education, a $200 million increase to special education, $30 million in early childhood education, $11 million in early intervention, $190 million in PlanCon, and that is only to cover existing debt, $16 million for pupil transportation, and $32 million proposed increase for pension costs, and that is just to cover the increase from year to year. Other policy proposals, the governor has proposed a personal income tax increase from 3.04% to 4.49%, and we'll go through why that increase is important. He also proposed a charter school reform policy, minimum wage teacher salaries to $45,000, and then he proposed a minimum wage increase to $12 an hour by July 1st and $15 an hour by July 1st of 2027. So in the next couple of slides, we'll focus on two specific components of the governor's address, of the governor's budget, and that is basic ed funding and cyber charter school reform. And so I've mentioned that the governor's budget proposal was bold, and that it was. However, Governor Wolf has been consistent with his priorities, and education has been on the top of his list every single year. And this slide demonstrates his commitment to increasing basic education. It shows you what the increases between historic increases in revenues versus basic ed have been over the years since 2007-8 through 18-19. And you'll see that there were some years that dipped in funding, some years that had slight increases. But one thing that I will mention is that the blue, which is the real estate increases, in the beginning years from 2007-8 through, I would say, 10-11, were higher than what we were receiving for basic education. The ones that I've circled are the years that Governor Wolf has been in office. And so each year he has made that a priority, and he continues to do so. And he continues to shine a light on state funding gaps, specifically in K-12. With respect to basic education, the governor is proposing that the state redistributes the entire $6.25 billion in existing basic education funds through the BEF formula. And this is significant because it creates winners and losers. And to cover those losers in this system, he would use $1.15 billion in the new personal income tax revenue to level fund So essentially, no one is getting less than the 1920 basic ed funding. But on top of that, he's adding 200 million to every school district so that every district receives an increase above the 2019-20 school year. In previous years, the governor has proposed lumping in Social Security, but this year he has proposed to keep that separate. So what does that mean for York Suburban? In basic education, York Suburban would see a 304% increase, or $8,641,000 in basic ed. There's an estimate of 279,992. And I say estimate because not all of the data components of the formula are updated. So it's likely that these numbers will change. There are no increases to Ready to Learn. There are no additional funding from the state for cyber charter school tuition. There are no changes to the transportation and no changes to PSERS other than them and Social Security, other than them meeting their obligation for the liability that is currently outstanding. So this is the formula that is used to run any new money. And that new money is anything that is put into the basic education after 14-15. And so what he's proposing is that we take the entire line item in the state budget and run it through this formula. So the response from legislators say that this budget is dead on arrival. And while it's unfortunate that that's the response, I think it's a great opportunity to start a very much needed conversation. And in the next couple of slides, we'll look at why. So this is a slide from a previous presentation. It's from the January 25th. And so you'll notice that 77% of our total revenues come from local sources. And those local sources are really made up by taxes. 76% of the 77% is real estate taxes and EIT, and 1% is other. 68% is just real estate taxes, current real estate taxes. And the state only makes up 20%, with the bulk of that being pension and Social Security. And you'll see that in the upcoming slide. And if I were to take our total local revenues and calculate what our per pupil cost would be, that's $15,785 per student just on the local portion of our revenues. And that's going to be important as we look at the next slide. And so you'll see here how the state revenues are broken down. You'll see that pension is 38%, Social Security is 8%, debt service is 3%, transportation is 4%, and so on and so forth. But basic ed is only 24% of our state revenues and 4.67% of total revenues. And if we were to calculate our current BEF line item against our October 1 enrollment, that's $951 for every kid in our district. With special education, we did the same thing. We took our special ed number and we divided that by the number of special ed students in our district, and that's $3,245. But mind you, the special education expense department expense budget for our district is over $9 million. And so there is a significant funding gap in both basic ed and special education. I wanted to put this slide in to show the significant increases in real estate taxes compared to the steady, slow increases in basic ed. And I think it speaks volumes to what we're seeing in our district. But I also thought that it was important to show the disparity within our own county. While this bar graph shows basic ed funding from the 2018-19 school year, it demonstrates the disparity in our county. York Suburban ranks least in basic ed funding in our county. So while some may believe that the governor's budget is bold and unrealistic, there's something to be said about the data that this is telling us. Yes, the proposal creates winners and losers. It does increase PIT, and yes, this may not be the right time for that, but there's a message here. And that message is that there are funding inequalities that still exist and are across the state, and something must be done about it. And so now I want to focus our attention to cyber charter schools, because this is a significant discussion that needs to be had. The growth in enrollment is steadily increasing. In December, there was a report that enrollment for cyber charter schools have spiked by 59%. 59%. That is like no other year. And it's every day that I hear colleagues across the state talking about how these numbers are increasing daily. And so with the enrollment increases, there are also increases to the tuition and the costs to each district for cyber charter. And this is the impact for just 2021. There was a significant jump between 1920 and 2021. And this slide shows a historic and estimate tuition costs for cyber charter tuition. This slide it communicates a lot of information, and it's actually just a visual. What I want you to notice in this slide is the differences in costs, in the tuition costs between districts. Each one of these represent a school district in our county and what their cost is for cyber charter schools for special education and non-special education students. And so for me, what this tells me is that tuition is not based on the actual cost per student. It's just based on the district's budget. And I'm not sure that that equates to what's happening across the state and what we're seeing as far as achievement gaps in cyber charter. And so this is the increase, another repeated slide, and the increase in what we're experiencing since 2010-11 to 2021. As of today, I looked at our enrollment numbers for cyber charter, and we're at 180 compared to 136 last year at this time. And I also want to make mention, I put in what our 21-22 rates are estimated to be, and what our current rates are. And the only reason our projected rates have declined or dipped a little bit from our current rates is because we made the shift in how we're recording revenues and expenditures for insurance. By us teasing out that cost and putting it in its separate fund allowed us to decrease our overall projected budget, which is one of the components of the tuition calculation. And that's why you see the decline in there. But nevertheless, we're still seeing a significant increase in costs and the number of students. And for us, it's in uncertainty because we don't know if this is a one-time year or if this is going to be ongoing. And so a few minutes ago, I mentioned achievement gaps. And if you take a look at the PA Charter Change website, you'll find this slide. And it shows you what the achievement gap is between all school districts in Pennsylvania and all charter schools. And it's significant for the amount of money that each of our districts across the state we're giving to each of these cyber charters. You would think that that money would go to kids and that the achievement gaps wouldn't be so great. But I also thought it was important to look at graduation trends. And I didn't just choose, the worst performing cyber charters in the state. These are cyber charter schools that we pay, that students in our community at York Suburban are attending. And you can see that many of them are below York Suburban. And so I want to talk about the governor's proposal when it comes to cyber charter. And over the years, there have been different variations of reforms and different proposals out there, but I want to dig deeper into his proposal because he's proposing a statewide rate of $9,500 per student. This is regular ed. And he wants to establish that as the baseline. And then he uses the weights that are used in the Act 16, which is a component of the special education funding formula. And he applies those weights against the 9,500 to determine what the special education rate would be. And then for charter, brick and mortar charter schools, he is recommending that we continue to use the same tuition calculation formula that we have, but instead we are allowed to have additional deductions. So we're allowed to deduct all of our federal money. We're allowed to deduct the expenditure line for cyber charter schools. And then we're allowed to deduct any funds which charter schools do not provide or revenue in which the charter schools are directly eligible to receive. So let's take a look at what this would mean for York Suburban. This has us at 179 students enrolled, regular ed at 155, special education at 24. You'll see our projected rates and what those projected costs are. And then if we apply the governor's proposal, you'll see that instead of our projected rate at 2.1 million, it would be a cost at 1.4 million. And for special education, it would essentially almost cut that in half if all students in special education were tier 1 of the categories. And that would be a difference between 682 and 344. And so essentially, this would look like a good plan. However, it's not. It has a lot of flaws in the system. Categories 2 and 3 are significant and can have significant impacts to our budget. And so category 2 would be $35,815 per student, and in category 3 would be $69,730. One category 3 student would cost us $41,000 more than our projected 21-22 special education rate. And then on top of that, cyber charters would apply the category. So we would have to take the word of the cyber charter and they would apply whether that student is a category 1, 2, or 3, and we would have to pay on the basis of that. A cyber charter is not required to provide sending school districts the full IEP. They'll send us the cover, but not the full IEP. And so we can't evaluate whether or not they've assessed the student correctly. And I think that this allows for even more disparities between school districts, because here the governor is applying a flat rate per student, but we don't receive basic ed on a flat rate per student. So why should cyber charters? So I'm going to stop there and ask if there are any questions regarding the governor's budget proposal. Okay.
Kathy, it's Joel, and I guess I would just urge you not to take any of the governor's reforms into account at all as you project our budget. I think
We have not.
The DOA is the correct assessment, and that's just the nature of the beast.
Yes. We have not made any changes using the governor's proposal. So moving on to budget information. At the January 25th board meeting, we provided the board with a preliminary budget that showed a deficit of $3.1 million. On February 8th, the board tasked the administration and set budget parameters, and those budget parameters are a 1.9 tax increase that generates 1.2 million of new money. The cost of a taxpayer is outlined before you. The use of pension reserves of 300,000, no other use of fund balance, and a balanced budget. So revenues equal expenditures. So using those parameters, we have started to work under that direction. And so I wanted just to highlight some of the changes that we've made. First, the increase to real estate tax collection rate. We felt because the performance on our 2020 tax season showed a 97% tax collection rate, we felt that there was no impact from the pandemic. And so we increased our projections for 21-22 to 97 from the 96. So that generated an additional $437,000. And then a 1.9 alone outside of the 1% increase for the collection rate is $795,000. And then we've included the fund balance use of $300,000. We've already started making adjustments to the personnel proposals that were that reflect in the January 25th board meeting. And we also made some adjustments based on the tentative agreement with the Teachers Association. And so the adjustments to salary and benefits and corresponding subsidies are due to that. We also had a contract addendum that we passed last month. And so we reflected that cost and reduction in transportation. At the same time, we evaluated what our current transportation subsidy is slated for, and based off of those numbers, we felt comfortable with increasing the transportation subsidy line item. We've made some other changes to the expenditures. We've included the budget for the top development. This is an area that I received prior to the preliminary budget, but neglected to add into the budget, and so that was my error. And so we have also some adjustments to school insight, the school psych intern, as well as other budget areas. And the other areas were adjustments to some revenues. We had revenues built in for TAC and Bright Horizons. While we're currently vetting a new childcare provider. We are uncertain at this time what revenue that would generate, if any. And so I didn't feel comfortable with adding a figure in that line item. We inadvertently duplicated the driver's ed revenue. We felt based on the EIT performance to date that we're not realizing a COVID impact. And so we've increased EIT to the 1920 level. The governor did not propose any funding for school safety and security, and so we've removed that line item. We've adjusted IDEA to actual for 2021, so that was an increase of 60,000, and we increase in the transfer tax line item by $209,000. That leaves us with a projected deficit of $1.6 million.
And Kathy, that's in addition to the expected 1.2 deficit this current year.
That's correct. That's assuming that we meet that deficit. Yes.
So we're creeping up on 3 million over the 2 years.
Yes. And so the administrators are tasked with cutting $1.6 million under the board's direction.
I'd like to offer a comment on that.
Yes.
Well, I see what your next slide is, so perhaps you could go a little further and then I'll comment.
Sure. Okay. So I wanted to provide the board with 2 scenarios for budget forecast. And so I wanted to outline what my budget forecasts are, and these stay the same no matter what changes I make to the 21-22 budget. Anything moving forward stays the same. So we've used the IFO projected Act 1 index for 22 through 25. We do not have projections for 25, 26, so I assumed a 3% increase there. There are no assumptions made to any other local revenues. We've increased Social Security and PSERS based on the 50% actual liability, and no other increases were made to state or federal. On the expenditure side, salaries were increased by 3%. So total salaries are increased by 3%. FICA Medicare is based on the 7.65% of total salary. And then the retirement costs are based off of the projections on from PSERS. And so annually that changes. But we have projections from 22, 23 through 25, 26. We did not assume any increases in health or dental costs, and objects 3 to 900 assume an increase of 2% each year.
Isn't that a little optimistic, not assuming increases in healthcare costs?
It is.
Over the past 3 years, aren't they going up 8 or 9% a year?
We are now projecting an increase for 21-22 at this time. Last year, for the current year, we did increase by 11.03%. Prior to that, we had not increased healthcare costs in the last, I want to say the 3 years prior to that. So given that we're self-funded and we're evaluating claims as, you know, on a, not only on a monthly basis, but, you know, quarterly and annually, it's safe to say that assuming a 0% wouldn't be the most conservative budget area. Nevertheless, that's where we are right now. So the budget projections that you see before you are with a 1.9% increase in 21-22. And as I mentioned, the IFO projections are in the Act 1 index for the local revenues for each year. And you can see each of the year's deficit. And this is assuming that we do nothing with, that we actually meet the $1.7 million deficit that we're facing this year. And then the 1.9, which is 1.9 because the $300,000 pension reserve, and then everything else if we don't cut, but that's only assuming if we don't cut. And you see how that carries on. And the projected year-end balance at the end of 25-26 is a negative $5 million.
Do I understand, Kathy, that this chart is telling us that what would happen were we to deal with the deficit by spending down the fund balance?
Yes.
Right.
Mr. Chuli, can I ask you to speak in practical terms to what happens in a school district when the fund balance reaches zero? We can't actually go into the fund balance, like we can't actually generate a negative end of year fund balance to the tune of $1.8 million, right? I mean, as soon as that fund is depleted, you can't actually hit a minus 1.8. You could say that your expenses are going to be over your revenues and your use of fund balance to the tune of $1.8 million, but you can't actually keep pulling dollars out of the fund balance once it's zero. So in practical terms, what happens in the middle of that school year?
Well, you wouldn't wait until the middle of that school year. You would address it prior to that school year. So it would be at the development of that budget year. And you're correct. We are not allowed by law to submit a budget out of balance, especially if we have no fund balance. Revenues must equal expenditures. And so the reality is that we would be forced to cut programs, furlough staff, and make every effort to bring that budget into alignment.
So my plea to those community members who are listening or viewing tonight is to think about the financial projections that are being shared, that we're facing depletion of the fund balance over the next 5 years, 4 years to 5 years. Even if we are to support tax increases at the maximum that's allowed by law, I would just remind everybody that our 1% increase passed by one vote last year. So solving this on the revenue side is mathematically insufficient. And it's going to require shared sacrifice, and it's going to require that we get started as soon as possible. And we have already made some moves to reduce expenditures. We're trying to find the right path as quickly as we can. But if we delay really even a year, we're going to have to make such a sharp turn at some point that some folks are going to fly right off the hayride. And that is the context, that is the background, that is the setting for a lot of the decisions that folks want to know why we're going through the couch cushions right now, talking about building realignments. And there are other sorts of reasons for building realignment that have nothing to do with money. But if you want to know why we're having to look at options like this, these are the forecasts that the board and the administration are looking at when we're being asked to have conversations about the things that we're talking about in these meetings. Thank you for accommodating my digression.
Thank you. If I have something I'd like to add as well, and this is not, this is meant to, in fact, complement what you said, Steve, but it's a different point. And that is, I took John last time, urged us to look at 1.9 and zero use of fund balance as a way to highlight what you are emphasizing right now, Steve. In terms of the final decision, however, I take the 1.9 to be a pivot point around which we understand these numbers. And in fact, if there will be academics that are hurt through this budget, that we look at what it would mean to have a 2.5% tax increase or other scenarios as well, that the 1.9% is not a final fixed number. It's just a number about which we analyze the budget, and then we have to engage in further debate on the margin about what kind of fund balance we may or may not use and what the exact tax increase might be. I just want to convey my understanding of the actual decision-making we have to go through in the next couple of months.
That's true, but even if you ignore the 1.9 that was a line in the sand to look at numbers from, even if you max that out this year, we're still talking about the same fundamental problem. You haven't fixed anything.
Yeah, I agree with that, John. So that's why I said what I'm saying is meant to be complementary to Steve.
Yeah.
There is no solution that is available to us through a tax increase to address what we're looking at on the screen. So I'm fundamentally agreeing with Steve. I'm adding, however, that we as a board will have to make a decision nonetheless on what the best number is going to be. And I don't see the 1.9 as a line in the sand. I see it as a way of clarifying what the difficult choices are going to be one way or the other. And I want to know from the administration whether 1.9% this year is compatible with maintaining our academic excellence. And if not, if we were to go to 2.5, what would that do for us this year? Understanding John's point that it's not going to solve the structural problem. But I still want to know what those differences mean for us.
I think Kathy showed that earlier. Didn't you put a slide up that showed the tax increases and the resulting revenue?
Well, actually, this slide here before you is a budget forecast using assuming a 3.6% increase in taxes. And you'll see while we are performing better and our projected year-end balance at 25-26 is significantly less than what it would be at 1.9, we would still be in a deficit.
This is Joel. Let me make one other point here, unless I'm seeing it wrong. The projected, let's start with the beginning fund balance of 11.5 million. That's the total of all of our fund balances, correct? That is not our unassigned fund balance.
That is correct.
And the unassigned balance in about a year and a half. This means major rethinking about these fund balances. Those are supposed to be used for long-term expenses for which we don't anticipate extra revenue.
Kathy, what is actually in the unassigned, the 11.5 million, the other fund balances, the assigned fund balances, just so that people listening know what they're looking at?
Sure. We have reserves set aside for pension, for healthcare, for capital improvements, for future debt service, technology, curriculum, and special education.
Okay. It's not going to get any easier.
So moving on to some items to consider. While we've budgeted for federal COVID relief money in this budget, it is a one-time fund. And so you'll see in any of these budget forecasts, let's see if I can put my pointer on. You'll see that this line here decreases because there's $1.3 million for federal relief money. One-time fixes are not long-time solutions. The governor's proposal budget is unlikely and it's not viable long-term. Simply because of the items we discussed. It does create winners and losers in the end, and there's no guarantee that in one given year school districts that lose in reallocating the funds through the formula wouldn't lose funding. In addition to that, there will be new federal money coming to us. At least that's what the rumor is. And how do we use that? How do we budget that money knowing that eventually it goes away? And if so, you recall back in the 2008, 9, 10 era where we had ERA funds, a lot of school districts relied on those funds and essentially had to furlough staff in the end because they no longer had that funding. Increase in cyber charter school enrollment. Again, a lot of uncertainty here. Will the increase that we're experiencing be a one-year event, or would it continue into 21-22 or further than that? Is the solution grade realignment? Perhaps if we move towards the grade realignment, we could reduce staff through attrition, decelerate the hiring, eliminate one administrative position, and align support services. Do we consider increasing taxes to the index, which would generate an additional $719,000? Do we use insurance reserve to cover the employer contribution for HSA? And what items do we have to consider in order to ensure long-term sustainability? So what's next? March 1st is the Personnel Committee meeting, and we will discuss what recommendations we have for the board as part of the budget. We have the March 29th, where we will propose a proposed final budget presentation. And then April 6th, we have a Property and Finance Committee meeting, and then board meetings following April 26th, May 10th, and May 24th. Are there any other discussion or questions that I can
Kathy,
help?
I'd like to thank you. That's good work you did, pulling all that stuff from the state in a short amount of time. Nice job.
Thank you.
Yes, I found that highly informative. And Kathy, I did have one question of clarification just to highlight. On the slide that showed what to do, where cyber charter uncertainties was one of your lines, could you say again what the total amount of money taxpayers in New York Suburban are paying for the 79 students that are going to cyber schools?
Total in our line item is about $2.8 million projected for the 21-20 school year for cyber charter.
2.8. So if I understand that, taxpayers in our district are paying $2.8 million for 179 of our students to go to charter schools, charter cyber schools.
That is my interpretation based on the fact that we get so little state funding.
Right.
And there is only a small fragment of the BEF money that goes towards cyber charter.
Right. So we're raising taxes. So if we went to a 3.6 tax increase, what amount of revenue does that bring? 718,000. Looking at comparing that to 2.8 million in 1 year that taxpayers are paying in our district for the cyber charter. I just want to make sure that's clear in what you are presenting to us.
So much for the commercials that say charter schools are free.
Mr. Chili, I think you made it clear, but I wanted to disabuse anybody of the notion that $8.6 million revenue enhancement from the governor's proposal is an annual item. But that's just make it
It's
clear to
not
everybody
enough.
that's
I,
a long-term projection. That's not, okay. You may already have won. All right. And what's the earliest budget year for us that any of those proposals might, from the governor, might start affecting our budgets?
say that again.
Well, I'm thinking the alignment of the legislative calendar and our budgeting process, right? So what's the earliest budget year for us that anything that's being talked about in Harrisburg might affect?
Tim is smiling.
There's this outside chance, like 1 in a million, that we'll see some portion of that this year. I think we have that same kind of chance in the following years. It's going to take the will of the legislatures to do the right thing and use the fair funding formula to fairly fund schools. But there's too many schools that will be perceived as losing in that scenario. And so I don't think there'll be a will among the legislators to actually do what they should be doing as far as a fair funding formula. And it's called that for a reason, because it's more fair. And they're choosing not to do it the fair way. They're choosing to do it the old way with a little bit of the fair way mixed in. How's that, Kathy?
Tim and I have the same belief that this is a fair, but we also differ that this is not going anywhere.
Yeah. Well, I said 1 in a million. You're saying 0 in a million.
Well, it's like anything that you talk to, and I've been working with some PSBA task force on charter school reform, and we agree that funding changes are just not in the wind for charter schools. Folks, they're here to stay. It's a question of how we fund them, if we can get the legislators to pay some attention. But they're not of a mind to go around changing that formula real quick or anything regarding charter schools. It's unfortunate. I hope we all live long enough to see some reform when it comes to charter schools. It's just what I've heard.
And while we're on that topic, and I don't know if this would be best addressed by Kathy or by Tim, but in a nutshell, how is that $2.8 million? How is that calculated per student? And how is it that it varies so much from one district to another district?
Because different districts spend
It's basically the tuition that school district pays to charter schools is based on the sending district's budget.
Yeah.
It's not based on anything else. It's not based on what the charter school spends to educate a child. It's based on what the sending school budgets. So, for example, a student going to a cyber charter from Lower Merion, that's a big windfall for that charter school because their budget per student is really high, much higher than ours. As opposed to some school district and maybe in a rural part where their budget per student is much lower. So imagine running a business and your customers coming in and they're getting charged based on what they can afford as opposed to what the service is worth. So that's the best way I can sum it up. Kathy, you got a different way of looking at it?
No, in part of and we've spoken to how it's not done properly, but it has nothing to do with their cost.
No.
That's the piece that I find so, I'll use the word unfair, but it's not that they have huge expenses or it just has nothing to do with what they spend on educating their students. It's what we spend on educating our students.
Correct. And cyber charters want people to believe that we're just passing the state money through us to them. Well, as we mentioned earlier, our state money per pupil is $900. So that means the taxpayers are spending $14,000 for each regular ed kid in cyber charter, and much more than that for each special education student in cyber charter.
For an inferior education, we got to bear that in mind too.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox, but I just think these points are important to make because I think we have an audience tonight, and I'd like to do a little, imagine that, education of some of the people who might be listening.
Yeah, it's very complex.
Well, I'd also like to say, and again, this is an interpretive point from your presentation, Kathy, that state support for York Suburban is lower than any other school in York County by a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, we're really, really low. So to understand the academic excellence of York Suburban over time, over years, it has to be the taxpayers that are providing the revenue for us because the state is not. So we're in a situation where we as a school board, the tax rate and the taxpayers, that's where our revenue is coming from for supporting the excellence of York Suburban. Unlike other schools, which can have a much higher percentage of state support. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, Stephen, the nearest district to us gets 75% more per pupil.
Right. I mean, on the one hand,
And they're at the low end too.
on the one hand, it's so admirable that our district has been able to have such high standards and successes under such conditions. On the other hand, it's a recognition that it's the property owners in York Suburban through their taxes that is really what enables our district to be what it is.
Good, let's raise the taxes.
Okay, if there are no other questions or comments, that concludes the business office report.
Thank you. Is Ms. Bowen here tonight? I haven't seen her.
No, and I haven't heard from her.
Okay.
So
I did speak with Mrs. Bowen. She regrettably says that she is, well, she is experienced, she's involved in a swim meet, so we celebrate that for her, but with regret, she can't be here with us this evening.
And they're going to win, right?
That we're cheering for. I was just looking to see if there was an update on it, but I didn't see one yet.
Okay. Committee reports. The committee meeting schedule is still posted. And we have Academic Standards and Curriculum Committee, Mr. Scalette.
Yes, thank you. The Academic Standards and Curriculum Committee met on February 16th at 5 p.m. and this was a virtual meeting. And we covered a number of items. First, Dr. Scott Krauser reviewed top survey results. And these were survey results on the online program. And we discussed at some length what these findings were. Second, Dr. Brian Ellis presented a proposal to us, which in a nutshell was to expand or is to expand the college courses that students could take as part of their high school degree. We discussed various features of this, and the committee approved the recommendation. So this proposal to expand the availability of college courses, the details of which could be found through a link, will come to the full board for approval. Third, there was a discussion of whether to include an A+ grade in the new grading system. And there was back and forth on the relative pros and cons of the A+ grade. And the committee requested that Dr. Ellis survey some students and teachers about their views on whether an A+ is a kind of scoring that would be good for York Suburban to have. And he would come back at a future meeting to share further data, further solicitation of views on this item. Fourth, Dr. Ellis presented a proposal that would change the marking periods from 4 marking periods to a grading system that was either by semester, so in effect 2 marking periods, or 1 long year, 1 long marking period. And the committee is taking these ideas into consideration, and the discussion of those possibilities will continue at a future committee meeting. And that brings us to the 5th item, where the administration recommended that grades K and 1, 2 and 3, and 4 and 5 would be grouped together across the district, and each level would be housed together in 1 building. And this would reduce the number of buildings from 4 to 3. From the point of view of the academic curriculum, the recommendation was approved by this committee. And so this item will now be sent to the board for a full hearing of all the relevant considerations about this idea. And earlier in today's meeting, Dr. Williams provided a schedule, which I was very happy to see, so that there's an opportunity to get full input by all the stakeholders at York Suburban on this idea. I'd also like to make one other note, that there were discussions of a long-term comprehensive plan, K through 12, a long-term comprehensive plan of K through 12 instruction. And that long-term plan for how to think about instruction from K all the way through 12, that will continue in the months ahead. And there'll be further discussions and data relevant to that into the spring and summer and into future meetings. Those were the items that we talked about. The next meeting is scheduled for April 19th, 2021 at 5 p.m. So let me ask if there are any questions. Okay, well, that concludes my report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Robinson, Personnel.
Thank you, Mr. Posnell. We have 2 items this evening. Item 1, the consent agenda. You have before you the personnel report, which includes 2021 substitute rates, employment, extracurricular positions, and leave. Would any board member like any of these items considered separately, or are there any questions on any of these items? If not, the chair moves approval of the below mentioned items.
Second.
Thank you. Questions or comments? I think this can be a unanimous roll call vote.
This will be considered a unanimous roll call vote unless I hear votes to the contrary. Hearing none, motion passes.
And as we scroll down to item 2, the board negotiating team recommends the approval of the proposed memorandum of understanding between the Board of School Directors of York Suburban School District and the York Suburban Education Association. The proposed memorandum of understanding is for a 1-year extension, which includes a salary increase as well as concessions in healthcare benefits as outlined below. Would you like me to read in my mellifluous tone all of the outlines?
Yes, please.
Thanks a lot. Item A, 1-year contract extension effective July 1, 2021 through June 30, 2022. Item B, salary increase of 2% inclusive of step. Item C, employer contribution to the employer's health saving account of 85% of $1,500 deductible for single coverage or $3,000 for family coverage. Item D, employee contribution remains at 10% of the total cost of the medical and dental insurance cost. Item E, spousal optional coverage remains at $150 per month premium cost.
So do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Questions or comments?
This is Joel.
Yeah.
Gonna make a comment to just make sure that people understand that the health savings account support by the board is actually a reduction from our current level. We currently cover 100% of that deductible. This reduces that to 85%.
Any other? So I have a thought. I don't think anybody would disagree that the work that's been performed by our faculty and administration over the past few years, this past year especially, has been superlative. You know, it doesn't surprise anyone on the board that we have the top performing district in the county, and we're one of the top performers in the state. As such, over the years, we've ensured that our faculty and staff are essentially one of the most highly compensated in the district. So I think we've been fair to them. Also, as one of the smallest school districts, we rank on top with our spending per student. Unfortunately, as you already heard tonight, we rank lowest in terms of state support. As we move forward, we've already said that our community funds our education. We've raised taxes for the past 11 years, and you've seen where we are. So we're not in good shape. We have a significant shortfall this year. We had a significant shortfall last year. And I think we need to find some way to postpone this. I don't think we can afford this right now. You know, everybody says that our taxpayers are good with paying for quality education, and I believe that. But this has been a difficult year. We've had unemployment at over 10% for a lot of the year, even though we collected our taxes. It's now down to around 5%, so it's getting better. But I wonder how many of our citizens in their district got raises this year. So it's just something to think about as we're looking at these deficits. I challenge us to come up with a way to figure this out, you know, without doing this. I think this is probably, if we look at health savings account and we look at these salary increases, we're probably looking at what, $750,000 of the budget deficit this year is just in this increase. So that's just kind of my thoughts. But I would open it up to other comments.
John.
Yeah.
I would support your comments, and I believe that while our staff does a fabulous job, we have been more than fair with them over the years. They are compensated well for what they do. And given this last year, there's almost no one that came out of last year or this year with raises in hand. And many people took cuts. I'm not comfortable. I'm not comfortable with this change. I do believe, you know, I do believe we should delay this, and given our future situation, we cannot continue on the path that we have. This is very comparable to the increase that's occurred every year for, you know, the reasonable past that we can look back on. And it's not sustainable. Well, it's sustainable in only one way, and that is with less teachers. So I'm not in support of this, and I do believe we need to figure out a way to do a better job with our staff expenses. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that for our purposes, this is a one-year extension. Your comment, Mr. Posnow, and your comment, Mr. Toman, these are all points well taken. And I think we all know, when I say we all know, I mean, the entire suburban community knows that there has to be changes. And they have to be arrived at deliberately. And I think we can do that. I think we're in the process of doing that. That was certainly the objective of the committee, with the advice of counsel.
Other?
Yes, I'd like to say that I fully support this as a one-year extension. I thank the work of the committee members who were able to negotiate this. And I certainly don't discount what John or Mike said, because next year there's going to have to be continuing conversations and deliberations. So I see, with respect to this issue, that the community has to engage in a conversation about how to balance the budget in the years ahead. With respect to this one-year extension, I fully support it.
Well, I guess the only other observation I would make is we had administrators last year that recognized the dire circumstances we were in and voluntarily took a no increase when they were in a pay for performance mode. I don't think that's reasonable to expect moving forward, that they're going to continue to take freezes while we give increases to everybody else. I would just make that observation as well. So, if there are no more, could we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Mr. Scalette,
Yes.
Mr. Robinson,
Yes.
Mr. Tillman,
No.
Mr. Posnell,
No.
Mr. Sanders,
No.
Mr. Sullivan,
Yes.
Mrs. Schrader,
Yes.
Mr. Sears,
No.
Mrs. Fryrick.
Yes.
Motion passes 5-4.
I believe that concludes your report, doesn't it? No, there's more.
No.
No, that's it. Okay.
No.
Mr. Tolman, policy review.
The following policies were discussed at the January 25th committee meeting and recommended out of committee for first read by the board at the February 8th and at the meeting tonight. Second read at the March 8th meeting and anticipated adoption at the March 22nd meeting. You can see that the policies listed below. Are there any questions that anyone has for the committee or administration?
Mike, I have a question, and it regards some of these ones such as the use of tobacco, which is 323, and a couple of these others. We're also doing some review at the York Adams Academy, and someone raised the question that in these, and I checked these, they use the word JUUL, capital J-U-L-L, and should we be putting a brand name in our budgets? I understand it's kind of the same thing as Kleenex. Is it a capital K or a small K? Kleenex is kind of a generic term. Was there any discussion of that at all here at York Suburban?
We did not discuss that at committee meeting, but I believe the language is what was suggested by PSBA, and therefore we moved ahead with their suggestion.
Okay, just curious whether it had been, thought about. Thank you.
If there are no other questions, then that concludes my report.
Thank you. Legislative update, Mr. Robinson.
Mr. Posnell, if I may interject, I just did get a update from Carly and the swim team, so I could add that to her report. It'd take 30 seconds. Happy to report that the girls swim team did beat Northeastern tonight, 88-81, and our very own Carly placed first in both of her events.
Good
yes.
Deal.
There you go.
And that concludes her report.
Thank you.
Right. Mr. Robinson.
Well, who needs a legislative report?
Yeah, that's right.
We all do. And on that note, I would like to add my congratulations to Mrs. Chichuli for her brilliant description of the challenges of cyber charter funding and how this case must be made forcefully and articulately to our friends in Harrisburg. And that actually leads me to urge you all to sign up for Advocacy Day on March 22nd, when you would have the opportunity to do just that, specifically to talk to our friends in the legislature about the way cyber charters are not regularly audited and how they engage in a shell game or a three-point Monty scheme in assessing student needs, especially special education needs. So on that note, again, and the tuition rates, we've discussed at length about how basically it's a scam. Nice work if you can get it, but since we're on the wrong end of that scam, I think we have to be more forceful in our argument in trying to change the situation. Hell will probably freeze over first, but we've got to try. That concludes my report.
Okay, thank you. Lincoln Intermediate Unit, Ms. Ferrari?
I have no report from the LIU or from the LIU JOA. And the only other thing I have then is York Adams Academy. And I'd like to thank all of you for your continued support and passing that budget this year. Those of us at York Adams Academy feel that we have something that's of value in the educational community here in York County, and we're pleased for suburban support. And that concludes my report.
Okay, thank you. York Adams Tax Bureau, Mr. Chuli.
No report.
Okay. York County School of Technology, Ms. Schrader.
John, I have no report from the School of Technology, but while I have the floor, I would like to remind any listeners that we might have that the school board election is coming up. And if anyone is interested in serving on the school board, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I think any of my colleagues on the board would be happy to answer questions. And a reminder that March the 9th is the last day to submit paperwork and signatures on your petition. And that concludes my report.
Okay, thank you. So you have a link to upcoming events here. I would like to take this time to thank everybody who has sat through this with us for a long evening. We really appreciate your input. And this would be the last opportunity for public comment if we have any more.
John, can I make one other comment, please, or kind of a statement?
Sure.
I know that there's Dr. Williams has a schedule out there of how he's going to be pursuing options and what have you here in York Suburban. And I'm hoping that when you go to plan those meetings that you'll have, I'm not sure how we're going to do it, given the constraints of our virtual meetings, but I hope that there will be plenty of time for exchange and listening to the comments in however way you do it, so that everybody has a chance. We've been getting, we have a lot of comments tonight, and I certainly like to hear from the community how they feel about the options that are going to be presented to us. And I hope there'll be multiple opportunities for that to happen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
There are no additional public comments.
Okay.
John, the only other observation I'd make is that just looking at the comments, and we appreciate the comments that we're getting from everybody, and we hope that they'll keep coming, is there appear to be some issues of real salient concern to people in terms of amount of time spent on buses and class sizes and things of that nature. I think I got to about 5 or 6 items on the list that really seem to have some mass behind them. And I think it's predictable that those questions will continue, and that folks will be expecting answers to those in the presentations that are made by the administration as we move forward.
Okay. Anything else? We are adjourned then. Good night.